But again, as I've said before, all the parties are up to it. The Conservatives are up to it. Liberals have been up to it. And it's a horrible practice that needs to stop. And it's part of what you've been talking about a lot, which is we need to stop the big money going into politics. We need campaign finance reform.
Welcome to the Rest is Politics with me, Alastair Campbell.
And me, Rory Stewart.
And Rory, I think we're going to have to talk at some length this week about various elements of the Israel-Gaza situation, which is flying off in all sorts of directions. And we also want to talk about Sam Bankman-Fried. But we're going to devote the whole of the first half of the podcast to various elements of, I think, what we have to call corruption. And it pains me to say that I think we have to start in the UK, because Rishi Sunak introduced a new phenomenon last week. There is now apparently something called the Easter Honours List. We're used to the New Year's Honours List. We're used to the Queen's, now King's birthday honours list, but we now apparently have the Easter Honours List, which seems to me to have been invented so that the second biggest donor to the Conservative Party, after the racist misogynist Frank Hester, who gave 15 million, the second biggest is this guy, Mohammed Mansour, who's given 5 million, who's now getting a knighthood. And Number 10 gave a very weird explanation for all this. They said that because Vaughan Gething was the new First Minister of Wales, he had to be elevated to the Privy Council. And this meant they had to sort of bring in other honours, which is complete and utter bollocks.
It's bizarre. It's completely bizarre. As you say, I remember people being put in the Privy Council, for example, when the Labour put someone new into the shadow cabinet, they could be put in the Privy Council without there having to be an honours list.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know something, Rory, I one of the papers worked out that since 2010, when the Tories got back in, there have been 96 MPs who have been given a knighthood or a damehood, okay, including Sir, we now have to say Sir Philip Davis, one of the most ludicrous last week in the Easter Honours. During our entire time in office, 11 MPs were given knighthoods or damehoods. Now, as you know, I think the whole system is ridiculous, but that is an 800% increase. In fact, Rory, you're now a very rare creature, an former MP who is not called Sir Rory. I think you should feel very left out.
Yeah, quick explainer for people who are not in the weeds of all this. So the British honours system is a system that was originally obviously controlled by the King or the Queen. And it's what allowed people to get into the House of Lords, made them lords, made them knights, gave them medals. And then increasingly, as we became a constitutional monarchy, it fell into the hands of prime ministers. And it was originally in the 18th century, there was a lot of creating people lords and baronets in order to get political majorities in the House of Commons. Then in the early part of the 20th century, it became more and more common to basically use these as ways of raising money for parties. So Lloyd George, from 1917 to 1922, created 120 hereditary peerages. I mean, these are not just life peerages, hereditary peerages. And he had an amazing list. He had a man called Maundy Gregory, who was this, to put it mildly, very colourful character who'd been a theatrical impresario, who had a list where you could buy a knighthood by giving £10,000 to Liberals, get a baronetcy for 40,000, and then a peerage for a large amount of money. And this horrified people so much that eventually a law was passed banning this process. But it was such a catastrophic law that the only person they ever managed to prosecute was Maundy Gregory himself, who in the 30s had gone so mad that he was beginning to sell the peerages without any access to government.
As we've just got through Easter, I take it he has nothing to do with Maundy Thursday. He's not involved.
Maybe his name was taken from the Easter thing. So he's an incredible man. I mean, he was such an amazing, notorious monster. I mean, one of his other great things is he, despite being very, very openly gay, he developed a relationship with an actress, got her to sign over her entire fortune to him, and then she died mysteriously in his house 3 days later. The police tried to exhume the coffin, but found that he'd buried her basically in Thames water, so they couldn't get any evidence of poisoning. So he was
Thames
probably
water. Well,
yeah.
we had clean Thames water
Exactly,
then.
that's right, exactly. Probably a murderer too. Anyway, so this then continued, and it's basically become the standard practice for all the political parties to give honors to people who give them money. But they never managed to get prosecuted, any of these parties, because the law requires such a high burden of proof. And basically, unless there's a written contract saying, in exchange for your cash, I'm giving you a peerage,
Yeah.
the Crown Prosecution Service actually has determined that it's okay to give money expecting a peerage, and it's okay to give a peerage or a knighthood in exchange for money, provided there's no formal written contract. So the whole thing's
Wow.
completely out of control. And I think in honor of our kind of trying to be objective and open minded, all the parties have been up to it since the Lib Dems in the 1920s. Basically, if you give a huge amount of money to a political party, you end up with getting one of these things, generally speaking. And we need to stop it.
I think the consequence of that though has been that it's now been normalised, so that actually, if you think about it, Frank Hester giving £50 million, and then coming out with all that terrible stuff about Diane Abbott. And yet that story's just gone away. If you remember when we were under the cosh for so-called cash for honours, and bizarrely, by the way, I didn't tell you this, Rory, when I was in Australia recently, I literally bumped into the man who became Yates of the Yard, the police officer who was investigating Labour for alleged cash for honours, walking down the street in Sydney. We had a perfectly civil chat, unlike in previous times.
Just explain that quickly for
But
people. So
let me
this
just
was an amazing moment where this guy literally arrested Lord Levy, who was Tony Blair's friend and the head of basically fundraising for the Labour Party, because of all this testimony for people saying that they'd wanted to give money to the Labour Party, but instead had been encouraged to give loans because they wouldn't be declared in the same way, and that a lot of those people seem to be expecting peerages out. But again, as I've said before, all the parties are up to it. The Conservatives are up to it. Liberals have been up to it. And it's a horrible practice that needs to stop. And it's part of what you've been talking about a lot, which is we need to stop the big money going into politics. We need campaign finance reform.
He interviewed Tony Blair under caution, and he interviewed several other people in Downing Street.
And then, a lot of this was because in those days, both parties, both Labour and Conservatives, were getting round the rules on declaring money by taking loans instead of gifts. So a lot of these people, of the £17 million that Labour spent in the 2005 election, 13.95 million was loaned. And the Conservatives, it was the same. They spent 15.95 million, of which
Yeah.
13 million was loaned. And this allowed both parties not to declare where their money was coming from.
Yeah. Now, let's bring in a hero, Dominic Grieve, KC, former MP. I don't know if you're aware of this, Roy. He led a committee which included people like Margaret Hodge and Lord Neuberger and Jonathan Jones, who was a government lawyer in the past. And he's produced this thing called the Governance Project, which is all about standards in public life and trying to clean up British politics. Now, I think he's a former colleague of yours. He was among the group that was kicked out because you and he and others would not support Boris Johnson's hard Brexit plan. He's now done this report, which I think we should put in the newsletter. It's quite long. It's very detailed, but I think there's a lot in it, which if we do get a Labour government, I hope that Labour will sign up to. For example, arguing that the Electoral Commission has been weakened and it needs to be strengthened. They're calling for the Elections Act to be repealed to allow the Electoral Commission to be able to undertake or direct criminal proceedings, that they should have investigatory powers akin to those of the National Crime Agency, and massive increase in the fines for offences, up to £500,000 per offence or 4% of total campaign spend. But the stuff which, and I think that is an easy thing for Labour to do, to come in and say, we accept that politics has got to be cleaned up, and this is one way to do it. But I think the really interesting stuff in their report relates to ministerial standards and the ministerial code. And again, they're saying that it might require legislation, because they want the ministerial code, particularly those parts related to integrity and ethics, put on a statutory footing. And this speaks to something that you've been talking about, Rory, where the role of MPs and ministers should be clarified, what their duties are, given guidance into how to avoid conflicts of interest, and so forth. And they're also calling for an independent commissioner that ministers should take an oath to uphold the code when they take office, and really, really strong stuff on both House of Lords appointments, which they're saying should be taken away from the Prime Minister and put solely in charge of this House of Lords Appointments Commission, and also big change to political honours so that Prime Ministers no longer make personal recommendations for honours. And I think these are all very sensible, very good ideas, which would go a long way to giving people the sense that Labour understands politics needs to be cleaned up, standards have to be improved and upheld, and this is a good way to do it.
Yeah. I mean, the House of Lords Appointment Commission thing, I think, is really strong because, as we've discussed in the past, I think you can make an argument for balancing an elected house with an appointed house. And the argument is the problem with two appointed houses is you can have a gridlock like you do between the Congress and the Senate in the US. So you could imagine a second house which was appointed, which was more, I don't know, a group of experts with big contributions to public life who'd renew legislation. But for that to work, it would have to be done on proper grounds. And one of the good things in the Grieve report is that they say, as you say, that the commission should be completely independent of the Prime Minister, how they're appointed, but also that they should be forced to publish the qualifications on the basis of which someone gets the job. So, if Darren Bent became a member of the House of Lords, it would explain.
Or Charlotte Owen.
Or Charlotte Owen, we'd explain, Lord Bent got this job because of the following 9 contributions he's made to public life, etc.
Yeah.
The other things they've been getting at, I mean, I think it's really interesting that they're digging into a lot of the problems that we have in the British system. One of them is this revolving door issue. So, you're a senior civil servant, you're a politician, you leave and you immediately get a job with companies that you have been supervising, or you come in from those companies. And there's a challenge, which is, we want people who've had private sector experience. We want to try to have some kind of exchange of ideas, but at the same time, we don't want conflicts of interest. And they've got quite a good line in the report where they say, you can't avoid conflicts of interests completely if you're going to have people coming out, but you've just got to be very clear about them. You've got to declare them. You've got to be able to recuse yourself, step back if you're making a decision that relates to this.
Yeah.
They've also been very good on ministerial appointments. I mean, one of the controversies we've done a lot on the podcast over the last couple of years is this question of when ministers start interfering in the appointments of people in government. And what they've proposed, which again, it would be great to see Labour take up, is a very clear list of who ministers are responsible for appointing, as opposed to who the civil service is responsible. And if the ministers choose to appoint somebody who goes against the recommendations, then the minister would have to appear before a committee, justify themselves and explain what they're doing. Because at the moment, the whole thing's very, very blurred. I mean, you get these, we had this thing with Michelle Donnellan 2-3 weeks ago where she was sort of influencing the process of appointing somebody unfairly, it now turns out, to a particular academic committee because she thought that they'd taken the wrong position on Palestine. And she does it through a tweet on social media, and the department's sort of scurrying around trying to do this. But there's no clear distinction saying this is or isn't one of the minister's powers.
Yeah. There's also going to be a kind of problem for Labour if they get in. And that is that because we've had this pretty substantial increase in Conservatives being appointed to the House of Lords, not least through the ridiculous resignation honours, but also Sunak has put a fair few people in there as well, is that in order to get legislation through, there's a risk that Labour, without doing this, and remember they're going to have to get the votes of both the Commons and the Lords to be able to do this if it requires legislation, Labour will have to put a load of more new peers in there to restore the balance. And we've now got 800 peers in the House of Lords, utterly ridiculous. So unless we get a grip of this, it's just going to get up and up and up and up, lose more and more of its credibility, lose more and more of its public support. So I actually think we had a question this week about what could Labour do in the early days when, it's going to take a while to sort the economy and so forth. I think this is something you could do straight away in a First King's speech where you say, we are going to have to make changes to the way politics is done. I hope they broaden it from this, but I think this is a good basis. And reform of the House of Lords, get it done quickly. It'll be very, very difficult because, people will squeal and people will try to block it, but reform the House of Lords. And I think if Keir Starmer were to come out and say, I am removing myself as Prime Minister and legislating so that future Prime Ministers will not be able to use the system in the way that it's been used in the past, particularly in recent years, I think he'd get a lot of political credit for that. And so I hope they read this report and act
Yeah.
on it.
Can I just, we should someday, I think, do a leading interview with a couple of chief whips. We talk a lot about the whips and the way that works, but it'd be lovely to get a sense of, if we can get them to be frank about it. One of the problems here, which Labour will also face, is the reason why the Tories have been doling out all these political honours. I mean, and Boris Johnson was particularly ridiculous. He's like kind of Henry
Yeah,
VIII, kind of trying to
yeah,
make his father a knight and his brother a lord and goodness knows what else.
yeah,
But the reason they partly do it is it's the way of the whips controlling their
yeah,
MPs. And they used to
yeah.
have more patronage powers because they could make people chairman of select committees. They can't do that anymore. So I think the Tory chief whip, if he's being friendly to the Labour chief whip, is probably saying to him, "We'll be pretty careful with this stuff about taking away the prime minister's
Oh, for
ability to
sure.
give out lords and knighthoods. Otherwise, how are you going to
And
control your flock?"
and listen, there will be people inside the Labour Party saying, look, we may not like it, but frankly, we may have to do some of the same stuff. But I think that change governments need to signal real change, and we've talked about this so much, and I think, and I know this from going around the country, this would appeal to an awful lot of people. There is a sense amongst a lot of people that politics has become grubby, that it's got worse, not better, and I think this is something where Labour can make gets a lot of political credit and actually improve our politics. Just briefly,
Yeah,
Rory, I'm
yeah,
later today. I'm off to Singapore, and which is a place I know reasonably well. And during the whole Brexit debate, we talked about this whole Singapore on Thames thing, which is about the economy. But one thing where there is a big difference is the code of conduct for ministers in Singapore, which has been around since the 1950s. It is pretty rigorously followed. And just to give you an example of the difference between the two countries, there was a situation recently where two ministers rented. They have very, very odd housing sector in Singapore, which is too complicated to explain here. But the government, this is two government-owned bungalows that were rented by two ministers. Okay, and now it wouldn't even register on the level of scandals that we've seen, right? But because somebody raised a question as to whether this was above board, whether they were given favourable treatment, and so forth, this led to a probe by the main anti-corruption body, the Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau. It led to the Prime Minister ordering a review. It led to a 6-hour debate in Parliament. And the Prime Minister, we should put his speech in the newsletter, Lee Hsien Loong. He made this speech where he was clear that although the official inquiries had found there was no wrongdoing, that it was all done above board, he was absolutely emphatic. It is utterly imperative that ministers are cleaner than clean. And he actually referred, without naming Johnson, he referred to other countries where we've seen the damage that can be done when you have inquiries and you leave things to ethics advisors. And he made the point that part of the job of being prime minister is that you know the difference between right and wrong. And I just thought it was a fascinating insight.
yeah. It's incredible, isn't it, Singapore? I mean, it's one of the real achievements of Lee Kuan Yew was to really focus on eliminating corruption. And one of the ways in which you can see how government policy makes a huge difference and how careful you need to be is that Singapore, of course, was originally part of a federation with Malaysia
Yeah.
and only separated up after the Second World War. In Malaysia, the corruption scandals have been completely out of control. I mean, very famously, there's something called, if people are really interested in this stuff, the 1MDB scandal,
Mm.
which involved the then Prime Minister Najib Razak stealing literally billions of dollars into personal bank accounts, and he's just been back in court again today. Um, Hong Kong was another example of this. I mean, Hong Kong was very, very corrupt. I was born in Hong Kong in the early 70s. Unbelievably corrupt. He used to turn up to work. I remember talking to old Hong Kong police officers. He used to turn up to work and you'd find $5,000 in your desk drawer on your first day of work as a police officer.
Wow.
And if you didn't take the money, your colleagues would completely cold shoulder you and you never get anywhere. They set up this amazing thing called the Independent Commission Against Corruption, and they sorted it out. And Hong Kong, like Singapore, became a very, very clean, non-corrupt country.
And they're both places. I mean, Hong Kong's got its particular difficulties now in relation to Chinese rule, but they're during those periods where corruption was being actively cleaned up, economically, that became part of those places' strength, and that's definitely the case in Singapore. And that's why the Prime Minister was so clear. He said, if we don't keep our politics absolutely clean, then we damage ourselves economically as well as politically.
Yeah, one of the things that obviously you've been looking at is this corruption scandal in Gibraltar, which of course is this territory, tiny, tiny territory. It's only about 2.5 miles square, which is actually part of the land of Spain. I mean, sorry, that's obviously going to get me in trouble, but it's
That will get
connected
you a
to the
lot of
Spanish.
Rory. That will get a lot of trouble. That is a
Connected to-
major diplomatic incident.
Connected to the Spanish mainland. It's not an island. It's a little tip which Britain conquered in the 1700s and has 32,000 people living in it, and was basically a British naval base, a little bit like, I mean, I'm not sure everyone quite understands that Guantanamo, the US base, is literally part of the land of Cuba, right? So this place, which 60% of its economy was the British Navy, as recently as the 1980s, has now branched into many different things: financial services, e-gaming, etc., and is surprisingly, for a place of 32,000 people, I mean, it's the size of a very, very small district council in Britain. But of course, it has its own legislature and its own chief minister, and it passes laws. And along with the Isle of Man and Jersey, which are these other bits of the British setup, it's almost a kind of independent country, which has King Charles as its king, despite being tiny. Anyway, over to you on the corruption scandal.
Well, it's been going for some time, but it's going to come to a head later this April the 8th, I think it is, when this hearing opens into something called, it's the McGrail inquiry. And McGrail was a guy called Ian McGrail. He was the head of police in Gibraltar. He retired, in quotes, halfway through his term 4 years ago, and claims that he was pressured to do so by the First Minister, Fabian Picardo, because McGrail had carried out a search warrant against somebody at the law firm where Picardo used to work. And there's now a British judge who's in charge of this inquiry. Some pretty high-flying British King's counsels are on their way to Gibraltar to take part in this inquiry. And I guess the basic allegation is that by McGrail is that he was forced out because his legitimate work as a police commissioner was getting close to somebody who was close to the First Minister. And since then, there have been all sorts of charges and allegations flying around, allegations of sexual misconduct against him, which have been knocked out, and also allegations that police officers were given incentives to say things against him. And it's all become a bit messy. And then into the mix, the government has brought forward new legislation to replace what was once the Commissions of Inquiry Act and to bring in a new law which replicates the laws that we have in relation to inquiries, which was something that was brought in after the Savile inquiry into Bloody Sunday. Now, why has this caused the absolute hoo-ha? Because it gives the government powers over official inquiries, which it did not have before, up to and including stopping them. Now, they say that they would not apply it to this inquiry, but needless to say, because they've rushed it through, and they normally have 6 weeks between a bill being published and a debate, and that has been sidelined. So it's quite a complicated story, and of course, Gibraltar does have issues with its reputation in relation to money laundering and so forth. So I think Gibraltar will be in the news more than usual in the coming weeks.
One of the things I guess that I think listening to all this is part of the problems of these places which are so tiny. I mean, absolutely. And obviously, in a place of a country, as it were, of 30,000 people, everybody knows each other. You know, Fabian Picardo's wife worked with the Hassan law firm, and the Hassan himself was chief minister of etc. before, and the man representing the government in the case was also the previous chief minister. I mean, it's tiny beyond imagining. and
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
corruption gets going in these places is very interesting. Other end of the scale, though, I mean, we're corruption. I mean, we've talked about corruption in Britain, and it's very difficult working out how you rank countries on how corrupt they are. We tend to think about Britain as pretty clean, but 80% of the British public believes there's a lot or a fair amount of corruption in British politics,
Mm.
which is pretty shocking. Transparency International has a list that tries to rank countries on how corrupt they are, and
The Scandies do
yeah,
well, don't they?
Scandinav's always up there, Singapore up there, Britain down probably to make British depressed is about level with France. Um, but Britain's only just above the US on the list, and that's pretty amazing too, because corruption in the US amongst senators and congressmen has consistently been sort of eye-watering. I mean, we've covered tinily just in passing, but Bob Menendez, who was a senator from New Jersey, who was literally the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I mean, incredibly senior senator, was found last year with $500,000 of cash
Yeah.
stuffed into pockets and gold bars in his house, and
Yeah.
had texted the full list of all the members of the US Embassy in Egypt to Egyptian officials. This money was coming, it seems, from the Egyptian intelligence service.
Mm.
And then we've had these incredible scandals in Europe, which are partly about a new form of corruption, or maybe it's one we're just becoming more aware of, where,
Where states buy MPs, I think, is
yeah,
a very old form of corruption.
yeah, well, I mean, this one is Morocco, Qatar, and Mauritania, and
Mm.
probably Kazakhstan, or certainly Azerbaijan, and certainly Russia, basically buying members of the European Parliament, different members of separate European parliaments. There's a British MP called Mike Hancock, who seem to have been implicated in very close relationships with Azerbaijan, to put it politely. Before I get into libel cases, you can read the Caviar Diplomacy piece by ESI, which points out that he kept endorsing the Azerbaijan elections. And as our resident election expert, Alistair, I think you can confirm for us that the Azerbaijan elections are not famous for their transparency.
No, I think he hasn't he just won his fifth in a row, and also rather sweetly, um, the one of his opponents has stood in every election against him, and I think he's risen from 0.3% of the vote to 3% in his 5 terms. So it's the opposition's clearly doing very well. By the way, Roy, before we get into the Russia, before we get into the European Union thing, when you were talking about Transparency International, there, I just quickly had a look at their website. The top story on Transparency International website is, as the UK score hits an all-time low, the time for action in corruption is now. And the second story is, when is modernising Gibraltar's laws a bad idea? So
Well, there we are.
they're talking about that one as well.
My final little anecdote is there was a man I had indirectly knew who was a South Carolina congressman called John Jenrette, who was done by an FBI sting in the early 80s. And when the FBI agent, who was a sort of fake sheikh, went in to see him to ask for offering cash in exchange for gambling contracts, John Jenrette said, "I've got larceny in my blood. I'd take the bribe in a goddamn minute." And all this is recorded on. Yes. Anyway, a little bit about Europe, because that is very interesting. We touched, I think, on a previous pod on how a Greek member of the European Parliament, Eva Kaili, whose father Alexandros had also been a former politician, the father was stopped with hundreds of thousands of euros in a suitcase. An Italian former MEP, Antonio Panzeri, a Belgian MEP, Marie Arena. And a lot of this seemed to be taking money from Morocco to get EU backing on trade
Mm,
agreements with EU, fisheries,
mm.
taking them off the human rights list. And then Azerbaijan seemed to be doing a lot of bribery of different sorts. I mean, incredible bribery. They had something called the laundromat scandal, which I think you've mentioned in the past, where they literally laundered over €1 billion through, paying people largely, I think, to back them on elections and human rights claims in the European Council.
I think we should introduce somebody called Victor Medvedchuk
Oh, yes.
um,
Okay.
to our discussions, because he is right at the heart of this European stuff. And he is a former Ukrainian national, former Ukrainian lawyer. He is godfather to one of the two Putin daughters that we talked about recently who went on the London Eye with my kids.
Yep, and who your daughter tried to take shopping in Clark's
Take
shoes.
shopping in Clark's shoe shops,
Yep, yep,
correct.
yep.
He now lives in exile in Russia. He's quite close to Putin. And he is the guy that both the Belgian Prime Minister and also the Czech authorities last week named as being at the heart of an attempt to influence the upcoming European parliamentary elections. And it's quite interesting if you think about it. There's the Belgian Prime Minister goes out and essentially says we are at risk of our elections being interfered with by these outside actors. And of course, when you've that background that you just described of straightforward, naked corruption, then that basically says that, well, the Russians are probably thinking, well, yeah, we will be able to find a few people that we can influence. And of course, a lot of this is about trying to influence the debate about Ukraine. So John Saws, when we talked to him, said, you couldn't say that the Russians tipped the balance in Brexit or tipped the balance in the Trump-Biden election of 2016, but that they are trying to have an impact upon the outcome of these elections is beyond dispute.
Yeah, I didn't, when I was in Parliament, admittedly it's only 2010 to 2019, hear rumours or see any signs that my colleagues were actually taking hundreds of thousands of pounds worth in cash from people. But the kind of thing that worried me more was how close people became at the end of their careers to companies, and often
Mm,
companies that they were working with as ministers or that they were meant to be scrutinizing. And that, I think, is very worrying, because one of the risks is that MPs don't radically call out and hold accountable things that are going wrong with companies. I mean, let's say, I don't know, that I was in fact, I was the water minister for a bit. Um,
yeah.
and if you're looking for a job in the water industry afterwards, are you going to really call out and say these guys are a disgrace? You create too much trouble. You're going to, when I was chair of the Defence Select Committee, was I really going to call out the defence contractors if I was going to be looking for a job? Um, I also, the other thing, Alistair, finally, that if we're talking about cleaning up politics in all these countries, is this very strange business of these friends of groups. So, friends of Israel, friends of Palestine, friends of India, or in Britain,
Mm,
all party parliamentary groups on Pakistan or whatever it happens to be, or Cyprus, which end up often providing paid trips for MPs to visit other people's countries, sponsored by those countries' governments, gives them a very, very partial vision of those countries that reinforce the narrative of those governments, and then produce a series of members of parliament, I'm afraid, and it doesn't matter which side they're on, right? It could be on either
mm,
side on Kashmir, either side on Palestine, either
mm.
side on Cyprus, who end up taking incredibly strong partial positions where I used to get a bit anxious about this. I mean, when I was invited on these trips, I would say, look, I'm a British member of parliament. I'm not a member of parliament for some other country, and I'm not going on a
Mm, mm.
paid trip for this stuff.
The difficulty with that is that if you're, we both bemoan the fact that too few parliamentarians take a real, genuine interest in a lot of big foreign policy issues. Um, how are they supposed to travel when the public get angry every time that expenses are published and why should they fly, why should they be taking airplanes here, there, and then everywhere? Well, I think the Americans have it better. The American state, I think, the federal government does sponsor politicians who travel around the world, or they have organisations like the one we spoke to recently, the Marshall Scholars, where they will fund people to go abroad. But I agree with you that is that is a thing that countries do, don't they? They get parliamentarians there, and they try to get them to become effectively spokesmen for their own government. I remember when I was a journalist, there was a Tory MP called John Carlyle, who I remember for two things. One, that he was a very prominent supporter of the tobacco lobby, and the other was that he would never say a bad word about the South African apartheid government. Um, and
And he would go on
he
trips there and stuff and be close to their government. And
absolutely, and
yeah,
and in
yeah.
so doing, would be able to claim that he was something of an expert because I've actually visited this place and I've seen what it's like and da 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 da. But this stuff in Europe. So Alexander De Croo, the Prime Minister of Belgium, he said in quotes, Russia has approached EU parliamentarians and paid them to promote Russian propaganda here. And on the same day, or the day before, the Czechs sanctioned this guy Medvedchuk and another associate, and also sanctioned this website called the Voice of Europe, which is based in Prague. So these are sort of very sophisticated influence operations that are targeted at our elections, or in this case, the European elections. And I thought it was very, very interesting that essentially 2 European governments came out within 24 hours. That means that the intelligence services are telling them something quite serious is going on.
And it's, boy, these operations are difficult. I mean, I guess we need to go to break, but it's fascinating when you watch. I mean, there's an article from about a year ago where Der Spiegel tries to run through the investigations that were done on some of these Morocco, Mauritania, Qatar allegations. But boy, it's difficult because a lot of these members of parliament claim immunity. Often it's their son or their father has the cash or their
Yeah,
husband has the cash. And
yeah,
pinning this all down seems to be really difficult. So well done, I guess, the police for tracking this stuff down.
yeah. And it all adds grist to the mill to the argument that Labour needs to put restoring trust in politics and standards in public life at the heart of their manifesto and campaign for government.
Excellent.
Take a break.
Welcome back to The Rest is Politics with me, Rory Stewart.
And me, Alastair Campbell. Now, Israel. We're going to go into Israel, but both John Sawers and Eliza Manning-Buller were pretty frank about that too, and essentially saying that, to quote Eliza Manning-Buller, she said, look, any government who was attacked in the way that Israel was on October the 7th would have to take action. But it's now reached the point where it is contrary to Israel's interests to be continuing in the way that they are. And likewise, John Sawers made the point that I think he had that extraordinary stat that he reckoned that 60% of Hamas fighters were orphans. Well, as he said, there's going to be a lot more orphans out of what's happening recently. So let's just go to Israel because there's a lot happening there. So overnight, we've had this attack. It seems to be by Israel on the consulate of Iran in Damascus, and they've taken out the commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and his deputy and others. And Iran are talking about what they call a harsh response. We've got these continuing massive protests against Netanyahu, where families of hostages have come together with political voices that simply want elections and they want to get rid of Netanyahu. We've had Netanyahu overnight under general anesthetic with a hernia operation. We've had the hospital in Rafah effectively reduced to the ground. And then we've also now had this tragic story, including the death of a Brit, an Australian, a Pole, and an American Canadian, amongst aid workers who have been killed in an Israeli strike, which has gone wrong. And then this big debate going on inside the Israeli cabinet over the exemption of Orthodox Jews from military service. And this has the potential, and Netanyahu is on the record as saying this could break the coalition.
Yeah, so Alistair, this is a really interesting issue because ultra-Orthodox Jews, or in particular, normally the Haredi
Yeah.
group of people who I think listeners will recognize as often being dressed in quite conservative clothes and who were quite a small part of the Israeli population when the State of Israel was founded, only about 5% in the 1940s, have had much larger families and now represent nearly 13% of the Israeli population and are on track, it seems, within the next 25 years or next 35 years, potentially have more children than any other part of the Israeli population. So they're a growing part of the population.
Mm.
And the deal when Israel was set up was to allow the Haredi communities to be able to continue their studies of the Torah and be exempt from military service. And the Israeli government funded this education provision. And this exemption seems to be renewed regularly, but the renewal did not go through this time on the 1st of
Mm.
April. And the Supreme Court has now said that education funding should no longer be provided for people who don't attend military service. And
Yeah.
back over to you on the political crisis this has formed.
When it started, by the way, back in 1948 with David Ben Gurion, I think there were only about 400 that this actually covered. And as you say, the state paid for them in benefits and education and all the other things that they needed to do their religious studies. It's grown and grown and grown and grown, as you say now, somewhere between 12 and 13%. And this has always been a subject of considerable division inside the Israeli community, because I think that the secular community, who kind of accept, some of them willingly, some of them less so, that they should all do military service. Um, there's been a real backlash from the ultra-Orthodox community. And of course, the reason this is so difficult for Netanyahu is because his cabinet is reliant on some of these extreme religious groups. And so he is arguing, he's the one who's asked the Supreme Court for an extension. He's asked to be allowed to take a bit longer to deal with this. He is on record as saying this could break apart the coalition. And of course, the protesters, they're nothing happier for them, because they want to see general elections and they want to get rid of him. But it's exposed a real divide within the war cabinet, because Gallant and Gantz, the two members of the war cabinet, they are worried about what they see as a manpower shortage, certainly coming down the track, and therefore they want to be able to call upon more of Israeli citizens to take part in the war.
And this takes us back to the story we were covering last year, which were the protests in Tel Aviv. This is before the Gaza attacks, which were about moves against the judiciary. And part of the reason why Netanyahu was making moves against the judiciary is partly because the judges were seen as being on the side of compelling military service and therefore alienated the ultra-Orthodox, but also they were stopping some of the settlements and therefore alienating some of the settler movements. And the other thing that makes this quite difficult to understand, I think, for outsiders, is that a lot of the ultra-Orthodox community, the Haredis, are either non-Zionists or anti-Zionists. So some of them
Yeah.
actually think that it's a sin to have a state of Israel before the Messiahs come. And their parties, or those that vote, some of them don't vote, but those that vote are an important part of his coalition. So there's Shas under Aryeh Deri, which has 11 seats, and there's United Torah Judaism, which has 7 seats. This is important because he's only got, his majority is just from 64 seats. But they are different. I mean, these ultra-Orthodox communities, so people who, you'll recognize them, the non-Lithuanian communities, for example, wear these fur hats and these big silk kaftans on the Sabbath. Very different from the parties of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. So Smotrich, religious Zionists, Ben-Gvir, which is this party, Jewish Power, that's come out of Kars, who are Orthodox Jews, but very, very strongly connected with the settler movement and with the idea of expelling Palestinians. So he's holding a coalition where the Zionists and the religious Zionists and the ultra-Orthodox are sitting together, but many of the ultra-Orthodox, paradoxically, have tended to be more moderate on the Palestinian issue.
Yeah, it underlines how fragile his coalition is, or could be, and it will take something like this. It could take something like this to break it apart. And meanwhile, of course, the Iranian involvement. I mean, there's been this shadow war going on between Israel and Iran for some time, but I think once you start hitting consulates and taking out commanders of the Revolutionary Guard, Iran probably does feel it will have to step
Well,
up.
I mean, attacking a consulate is a very extreme thing to do because of this idea of diplomatic immunity. I mean, generally, the idea is that in anybody's country, however badly you behave, an embassy is almost sovereign territory. It's exempt
Yeah.
from this kind of stuff. And interestingly, there have been big criticisms of this strike from Saudi and UAE, which are traditionally very, very opposed to Iran. And in fact, a lot of their relationships with Israel were because they thought Israel would back them against Iran. But they've come out, along with usual suspects like Russia, criticizing this attack. And the fear is that there is quite a large chunk of Israeli public opinion that now wants to take the war into Lebanon, wants to take on Hezbollah. I've had relatives and friends in Israel over the last 2-3 weeks, and the first thing they notice, of course, is that there are very few tourists to be seen. The airport very, very empty. But many of the people they were meeting are beginning to say, we made a mistake going after Hamas after the Gaza attacks. We should have gone straight after Hezbollah, which is the Iranian backed Shia groups in Lebanon, who are much
Mm.
larger, much better armed, and pose a much greater threat to the Israeli state. So, and maybe we've, part of the conversation from were some of these Israeli businessmen in particular saying, we've wasted a lot of international support going after Hamas when what we really needed was the support to go after Hezbollah. So there's a suggestion that when they attack the Iranians, some parts of the Israeli government will be thinking, we don't really mind if Iran responds, because if Iran responds, it's then our excuse to go after Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Yeah. A couple of other quick final points before we go on to your friend Sam Bankman-Fried. I use the word friend very loosely there. The Netanyahu, we talked about corruption earlier. He is still facing some very, very serious corruption charges related to fraud and bribery. And the other big development this week, which I haven't seen get much discussion here, is the other new law that they're bringing forward is one to block Al Jazeera inside Israel. Now, that says to me, and Netanyahu says some very, very, very strong words. I think he talked about them being actively involved in the events of
Mm.
October the
Yeah.
7th. So, on the one hand, you've got Israel leaning on the Qataris to try to keep some sort of process going on. On the other hand, they're saying you run a kind of evil propaganda outfit and we're going to shut it down inside Israel because you've basically become spokesman for Hamas. And I wonder if that's about just creating another enemy.
Well, it's also very worrying because, of course, Israel is very, very proud of being this strong democracy traditionally with an independent judiciary, a free press, and Al Jazeera has played a completely vital role in reporting on what's going on in Gaza. They've been able to get far more reporting out on the ground. They've had some very, very courageous journalists.
Yeah, hardly anybody else is still there.
Very, very worrying to start doing things like shutting down independent media. And that, I think the final thing, of course, is that the big story still are all these trucks blocked at the border.
Mm,
And there are, hundreds of trucks loaded with supplies ready to go through. Again, I've been talking to friends in Jordan this week who are just horrified by it because they say that, on a given day, you're expecting to get 1,000 through. About 120 will be signed off, and of those, maybe only 30 or 40 actually cross the border. And
mm,
they're being stopped again and again, sometimes on security grounds, but sometimes it's tiny grounds, and it's very, very difficult to understand why more of these humanitarian supplies are not being allowed through. The Israeli
yeah.
government, of course, denying this, continuing to say, no, 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 these are just procedural issues. But and this is not going to be fixed by the Americans. It's very difficult not to feel there is a strong pattern of obstruction on these humanitarian supplies, and it's not going to be fixed by the Americans opening a port. If America was serious about it, what they would be doing is doing what we do in other humanitarian emergencies around the world, which is escorting those trucks in with UN peacekeepers or US soldiers and saying we're coming in to deliver humanitarian supplies and overseeing that
Mm,
situation rather than trying to open this port, which will never be able to take the number of
mm,
supplies that people need. And this comes back to the question of how much pressure America is prepared to put. And you and I were looking at an article earlier this week, which was going in detail into what Bush Sr. did in 1991, where he held back
mm.
a $10 billion loan guarantee in order to freeze settlements. And it's very interesting how many things remain the same. I mean, this is 33 years ago, but there you
Mm.
had an Israeli cabinet minister calling George Bush Sr. an anti-Semite and a liar, Ehud Olmert calling him contemptible because of US attempts to put pressure on the settlement issue.
You're getting sort of mixed signals from the United States at the moment, in a way. That you had the situation where they didn't veto the Nations resolution on a ceasefire. That was seen as quite a big move by the Israelis. They came out straight away last night and criticized Israel over this move in Al Jazeera. And they do keep banging the drum hard in relation to access for aid. This charity, World Central Kitchen, who've lost these people overnight. I mean, I suppose the other thing, you would know more about this than I, but will there be is there a worry that when you see things like this happening, that some of the aid organizations think, well, this is just becoming so difficult. It's harder to get people in there. It's harder to get people to go and stay there when this kind of incident happens? Or do you think it just galvanizes people to say, right, this underlines the importance of the work that we do?
No, no, you're completely right. I mean, this is terrifying. I mean, I've got a lot of friends working with organizations working in Gaza, some trying to get into Gaza to work. But this is really, really scary stuff because normally, as an international aid worker, you are pretty exempt. There are a few exceptions. The Taliban killed Médecins Sans Frontières workers in end of 2001, beginning 2002 in Afghanistan, but that led to Médecins Sans Frontières withdrawing all its operations from Afghanistan. That was a very
Mm,
shocking incident more than 20 years ago. But
mm,
you certainly do not expect one of the most technologically advanced, sophisticated armies in the world to be mounting strikes against foreign aid workers. I mean, that's a totally different level and actually means that it feels now, will feel for for many aid workers, one of the most very dangerous countries in the world to operate. I mean, it'll begin to feel to people as it does operating in Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo.
mm. Maybe to end on a slightly lighter note, have I told you this story about? I was thinking about Netanyahu with his general anaesthetic for his hernia operation, and wondering whether he had any thoughts as he went under as to the politics of the people who were in charge of him. Because I had a general anaesthetic a few years ago for an operation on my nose when I had this problem with my breathing, and when I came round, the doctor was standing by the bed, and he said, "You were very, very lucky." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, the operation went fine, but I have to tell you, the anaesthetist is a massive Corbynista." And she spent the whole time saying, "I could be a hero. I could be a hero. I could take him out right now."
There we are.
So there we
Good.
are. Risks
Um,
of anaesthetics.
well, finally, Sam Bankman-Fried. So Sam Bankman-Fried, the famed founder of the FTX crypto exchange, this child prodigy who in his 20s became a multi-billionaire, who set up lavish operations in the Bahamas, who invited Tony Blair and Bill Clinton to appear on stages with him and some of the greatest rock musicians in the world, and was a particularly close friend of our new friend Scaramucci, or your older friend, Mr. Scaramucci, who gave this interview on Leading, who again was one of his co-investors, was there in the Bahamas as the whole thing blew up.
Yeah. Yeah.
And blew up in a way that lost $8 billion worth of his depositors' money. And it now becomes clear, because he's just been sentenced to 25 years in jail, partly thanks to the fact that the people who ran the company with him, who were other young people in their 20s and early 30s, including his girlfriend, testified against him and explained that he basically thought he was above all these laws. And he borrowed money from customers' accounts to try to deal with this run on the money, essentially stole their money to try to bail himself out, and then made the extraordinary mistake that many massive egotists make of trying to defend himself in court instead of having a lawyer.
Yeah.
So he stood there, nitpicking with the judges, avoiding lying, seeming very, very peculiar, and giving weird interviews to journalists. He did this amazing interview with an Asian American journalist who was actually quite an obscure, in her own description, quite an obscure blogger who suddenly got called up to see him, and he opened up in the most incredible and self-incriminating way. He managed to say, "Oh yeah, all this stuff about my trying to regulate crypto was just bullshit, and I was pulling the wool over the eyes of the government." And so, in some ways, he's been convicted on his own words.
Yeah. And it was pretty clear from the judge that the judge did not like him, did he? He really didn't like his demeanor and the way he dealt with the court. I mean, Fiona and I, last time we were driving through France, we listened to the Michael Lewis book on Sam Bankman-Fried, and even now, having followed the court case a bit, and also having listened to that book, I can't quite work out whether he is a con man. I mean, he's somebody who openly has autism spectrum disorder. He, in fact, he made that case in court that was the reason why the judge should go easy on him, because he would find prison a very, very difficult place to be. But he's somebody who just felt that he was always able, because of the power of his brain and his ability to handle maths and deal with data, which he realized was the kind of, the most powerful thing in the world right now. He felt that anything he did was allowable because he was sort of special in that field. But was it a con? Even now, I'm not convinced that he was conning people. I think it's just that he thought whatever he got coming towards him, he'd be able to deal with it. And that pic you mentioned, Tony Blair and Bill Clinton. I remember when the three of them were photographed together, and there's Sam Bankman-Fried with his kind of wild hair. I think he was wearing a t-shirt and shorts and sort of really scruffy kind of trainers, and he just looked. I thought, what are Tony and Bill doing with this guy? And and yet, the book, if I'm right, I think it starts with Anna Wintour, who is, a real kind of fashion guru, and she runs this thing, the Metropolitan Ball, and she's desperate to get Sam Bankman-Fried to sponsor it and to be there. And he says, yeah, 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 and he then just doesn't turn up because he sort of thinks, well, right now in this moment, I can't be bothered, so I won't do it. Doesn't care what people think, doesn't care about upsetting people. And yet, which is what I think might provoke your interest in him, was big on this whole thing of effective altruism, sort of earning to give money
Yeah.
away and
Well, and it's
utilitarianism.
very difficult to know how much that was sincere and how much wasn't. But
Yeah,
yes, he very much believed in effective altruism, which is connected to the work I was doing with Give Directly. And one of the reasons Give Directly got going is because it was able to demonstrate that giving unconditional cash had more impact than other types of charitable activity when you measured it
yeah,
in terms of randomized controlled trials. I mean, also sort of scientifically, like a medical trial. Effective altruism is really about proving how far your dollar goes. And he was a real pioneer in this work and therefore got some people like Peter Singer, who's this very distinguished Australian philosopher, to appear on stages with him. And I think Peter Singer now regrets it deeply. I dealt with his foundation, Sam Bankman-Fried's foundation. It was very odd, though, dealing with them because on the one hand, they were very generous and offering to give away billions. On the other hand, the call I had was extraordinary. I called the head of his foundation to see if I could interest them in a project helping the extreme poor in Africa. And after about 15 minutes of my pitch, this guy who was sitting in California in his hoodie said, well, I haven't had my lunch yet, so I think I'm going to go and have my lunch. And I said very earnestly, oh, well, yes, of course you must have your lunch. I don't want to keep you off your lunch. But, can we reschedule a call for a few weeks' time? Because I think this is a really important issue. And he said, to be honest, I'm not that interested in poverty. And then he hung up and went off for his lunch. And I thought, my goodness, this is pretty brutal stuff. I mean, somebody who can
mm.
say that to me. I mean, I understand he doesn't. At least he could pretend, right? And that was the head of his foundation. Um, so
You never met or spoke with
with Sam Bankman-Fried stuff,
Bankman-Fried
no,
himself.
I was put in touch with the head of his foundation because someone put me in touch with Sam, who pushed me on to the head of his foundation.
Mm.
Um, but it was a very odd culture. I mean, there's a
So what did they get? What did they give money to?
so they increasing. I mean, a lot of the money didn't come through in the end, but they were
Mm.
increasingly interested in uh, sort of futurology. They were interested in the risks posed by asteroid strikes and robot overlords. They said we were underpricing. So while I was saying,
God.
we've got to concentrate on 700 million people in extreme poverty today, they were saying, no, 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 you're being too short term. We need to put money into preventing the threats from 40, 50, 100 years in the future.
Wow. It is an amazing story though. And he got 25 years. They were asking for 100 at one point, weren't they?
Yeah.
I think Bernie Madoff, great name for a con man, Madoff, he got 150
But
years.
of course, he was a very old man when he got that, wasn't he? Yeah. So he
Yeah. So
died.
he's 25 years. So I guess, look, he will get out at some point. Um, I suspect he will find prison quite a tough environment. I don't know. But the book was very, very interesting, and it was one of those books where Michael Lewis, and I wonder if it was an ego thing. Michael Lewis is quite a big deal. He got a lot of access, and you got the feeling of somebody who, a bit like Musk, I think, doesn't really give a toss about what anybody thinks or says about him,
Yeah.
but is probably utterly bewildered as to how he's ended up in jail.
Having believed, according to his girlfriend, that he had a chance of becoming president of the United States just a couple of years ago. Um,
Yeah, that was
so,
never going to happen.
and anyone wants to follow up, there are some great documentaries that have been produced on FTX, including some starring our friend Scaramucci. BBC's done one, CNBC's done one, Bloomberg's done one. Um, and for people interested in the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel, there's a lovely Netflix series that I'd really recommend called Shtisel. I've obviously mispronounced it, but it's about a Haredi family living in Jerusalem, and it's warm, affectionate, profoundly eccentric, following the lives of a young man trying to adjust and a young woman trying to adjust to living in this community.
And Rory, for anybody interested in the constitutional arrangements surrounding the Rock of Gibraltar, which at one point I think you said belonged to Spain, I suggest they go and read the Treaty of Utrecht. I
Oh,
think it
very
was
good.
17th. I think it was
Oh,
1713. I
blimey.
can't remember.
The Treaty of Utrecht, eh? Gosh, that's well,
I think that's where
that's some
the
good reading,
Brits
good
managed.
reading material. I know about the Treaty of Utrecht because when Gordon Brown, your friend Gordon Brown, got me in to talk to him about Iraq in 2008, I spent, I think, an hour with him. And during the hour, he spoke, I think, for 56 minutes of that hour, during which time he took.
You learnt a lot. That's good.
Exactly. He told me a lot about the Treaty of Utrecht.
There you go. Why was he talking about that?
Oh, well, I think he was interested in the Westphalian system and state sovereignty. I thought, given he got me in to talk about Iraq, I was going to get a bit more in about Iraq, but, I was educated.
Good. You were polite. Should we just, for those who didn't see it, should we remind people what our April Fools were?
Yeah, go on then. Well, I sent out one.
Yours was way too far-fetched.
Well, he didn't like it. You didn't like it at all. It clearly hits a very sensitive note. I sent out a mild announcement saying I'd been made head of product management and challenge at Burnley Football Club. And Alastair was so outraged by my touching on this thing, which is almost family for him. He destroyed my April's Fool with an immediate reply saying, ha, 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 bullshit, fool the other one. So anyone going to my timeline had it all.
Yeah,
exploded.
I probably was a bit. I should have just let it sit there, and then I should have separately. I did my April Fool as a response to yours. I thought mine was quite good though. It was basically that Eton College had asked me to head up a committee to work out how to put their sporting and cultural facilities into public ownership.
Well, that was good.
Thing to do.
That was good.
Yeah.
That worked well. Right.
All right, Rory. See you soon.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.